This is Transfiguration Sunday. I have transfigured from a robe-clad baby dedicator to a more casually dressed Youth Sunday speaker right before your eyes. I want to thank our young people for sharing their stories today in their testimony, in their prayers, in their song. Every story matters. Every story matters. There's probably no story in the Bible where this is more clearly conveyed than in Jesus' transfiguration. Even though it's mysterious, it conveys to us the idea that every story matters. And so Jesus took Peter and James and his brother John, led them up to a high mountain by themselves. He was transfigured before them. He began to glow. His clothes became white like the sun, dazzling white. And suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah. Moses and Elijah. The stories of our past matter. Moses and Elijah appeared to Jesus. Moses, who's equated with the law, Elijah, who is equated with the prophets. These two men embodied the whole of the Old Testament. Every story in the Old Testament, all of the law and all of the prophets, all of those stories wound up in these two individuals to say the stories of our past matter. And so it's good to talk about some past stories on Youth Sunday. You know, if we were all to be transfigured today, if we were all to start glowing and our clothes turn white, I wonder who would appear from the past to be with us. I was thinking about that this week and I thought probably Roger Williams. You know, Roger Williams established the first Baptist church in the United States and endured persecution for doing it. Baptists and Quakers were outlawed in almost all of the colonies. Baptists were imprisoned, Quakers were hung. Because we didn't preach and do services in a ruly way. We were unruly people. We said too much, the Quakers didn't say enough. Neither one of us followed a book of prayer the way the Puritans or Episcopalians or Presbyterians and Roman Catholics did. And so for decades we were persecuted, and that's why for decades and centuries since, we have vehemently fought for and defended separation of church and state and religious liberty for all people. There was a time when Baptists were the minority in this country, were persecuted as a minority, and after we fought for and won our rights, do you know what we did? Are you ready for this? Baptists went to court and defended and fought for, are you really ready for this? Do you know that historically Baptists in court fought for the rights of Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Unitarian Universalists to ensure that they were free to live and practice their faith the way they chose? It's really only been in the last few decades that Baptists became a majority religion in the United States and began acting like a majority instead of a minority, wanting some sense of political power or to restrict the beliefs of others. But if while we are a majority, we forget what it was like to be a minority and start restricting the beliefs and practices of others, we do not secure our own freedom for the future. We need Roger Williams to show up at our transfiguration and remind us of the stories of our past. William Bullen Johnson might show up. Does anybody know who he is? Oh, you're telling on yourself. Walk down the history hallway of the church. First pastor of First Baptist Church, Greenville, that fledgling congregation of 9 women and 1 man. I'd like to know his name. We know William Johnson's name. That little church that sent the first single woman onto the mission field in 1872, ordained women in 1975, had women on the ministerial staff here in 1989. Of course, every story from our past is not going to be good. L.D. Johnson might show up at our transfiguration, remind us of a day in our church's history where the membership of the church had a discussion, and I'm putting that mildly, had a discussion over whether blacks could be admitted for worship or for membership in the life of the church. I mean, let that sink in for a moment. That wasn't that long ago. We had a discussion and had to vote on something that God had already decided, that God so loved the world. But the stories of our past matter. And it's not just First Baptist Greenville stories that we need to remember and keep in mind. It's the broader stories in our culture. Do you all know the story of St. Jude Hospital? You know St. Jude Hospital, the children's hospital in Memphis that gives free care to critically ill children, no matter where they're from or what disease they have? It was originally the dream of Danny Thomas. How many of you are over 70 years old and you remember Danny Thomas? That's a bad story for Youth Sunday. Sorry, young people. Danny Thomas was a wonderful entertainer, a wonderful Roman Catholic, was connected with St. Jude Hospital and wanted to make sure that children who were critically ill had free care at that hospital, but he could not get the city leadership of Memphis behind him. And so he called some of his friends in Chicago. By the way, if you didn't know it, Danny Thomas was of Syrian Lebanese descent. So he called some of his friends in Chicago who were Arabic, mostly Muslim, a few Christians, and they formed a coalition to back St. Jude Hospital, which birthed the ALSAC, the American Lebanese Syrian Association of Charities. And in their first year in 1958, they raised $375,000 for St. Jude Hospital. And in 2010, they raised $735 million for St. Jude Hospital. Muslim, Lebanese, Syrian Americans wanting free health care for America's most critically ill children. If I'm asked once a week, I'm asked 10 times a week, what do I think about the present political climate? I'm just going to move on. I will say this. I've already told you in a newsletter article what I think. I think that it's my obligation as a citizen and a Christian to prayerfully support whoever is elected president. I have always felt that way. But none of us blindly support all the policies of any president. And in fact, the minute any politician, and I'm not talking about presidents, I'm talking about local, state, or beyond, the minute any politician threatens religious liberty of any faith, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or other, or threatens the separation of church and state, or threatens women's rights, or racial discrimination, or any other kind of discrimination, this Baptist and every other Baptist ought to remember their stories from when they were a minority and be active and verbal in your world. The stories of our past matter. And the stories of our present matter. So Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I'd like to build a little hut for you and Elijah and Moses, because it is good for us to be here at this place, at this time, building something to mark God's work among us." The disciples understood that what's happening right here and right now matters. So in the past 6 months, I have been to several Children's Church League basketball games. I have visited 2 different schools. I have been at the funeral of several of our members. I've been at a couple of receptions for members of our church who've received community service awards. I was in a race to benefit Mission Backpack last weekend. I almost won. You get the picture. Thought I'd throw that in. You get the picture. Our church is all over the place today. At one of these events, one of our church children ran up to me and hugged me and looked up at me and said, "You came." And then she paused and said, "I love my church." She didn't say, "I love you," or "I love my pastor," or "I love my senior minister." She said, "I love my church." What we are doing with and for each other right now matters. Stop all of these things, all of the things that I have mentioned and more. Our church, our community, our lives, our worlds would suffer. We would miss moments of ministry with each other. We would miss joys of life with each other. The disciples understood how important the moment was, the present story was. But before we lift them up too much, what the disciples failed to realize was that everyone else's story matters. Friday morning, I got to work a little early. There was a man standing at the office entryway door. His eyes were bloodshot. He looked tired. He asked when I came up with my keys and my little backpack if he could speak to the preacher. I said, "Yeah, I'm the minister. Come on in. I'll talk with you." We went back to the office. I sat down. I said, "Well, what's your story?" Well, we asked people. He said, "It's a long one. You don't want to hear it. I just need $5. I appreciated the honesty. I said, "I'll give you $5, but I have to hear the story first. And it has to be true. I don't care what it is." And he paused and looked at me and started sharing a story of his own addiction and his own aimlessness and his own loneliness and his own anger. And when he was finished, we stood up and I gave him $10. And I walked him to the door. And I couldn't have planned the moment better for this morning's sermon. It's just the way God works. He said, "You know, I kind of hoped I'd get the money, but I never thought you'd really want to hear the story." And I said, "Well, this is church, and your story matters. And we hope you come back." You heard the way the story ended a moment ago. Lord, let's build some monuments up here. Let's build some huts up here. This is the only stories that matter, right? The stories of our past and the stories of what is happening with us right now. That's what matters, right, Jesus? And Jesus says, no, that's wrong. In fact, we're going to go down the mountain. And did you hear the story? And I don't want you to tell anyone what happened here today until after my resurrection. You don't get to tell this story to anybody. Keep it to yourself. Now, what in the world was that about? Have you ever been in a conversation with a one-upper? Yeah, you have, haven't you? You ever been in a conversation with a one-upper? No matter what story you tell in your life, they have to one-up you. Their cold lasted longer than your cold. Their wreck was worse than your wreck. Their goiter is bigger than your goiter. Their pet is smarter than your pet. No matter what story you tell, they always jump in and one-up you with a story of their own. They can't appreciate your experience and your story because they have to one-up you with theirs. Can you imagine being one of the only 3 disciples that witnessed the transfiguration of Jesus? No matter what else anyone else says that God has done in their life, can you imagine holding that story? We saw Jesus transfigured and had box seats right next to Moses and Elijah. I touched the hem of Jesus' garment and I was healed. Yeah, well, we saw the transfiguration and had box seats right next to Elijah and Moses. He called me down out of a sycamore tree and he had lunch with me. Really? We saw the transfiguration and we had box seats right next to Elijah and Moses. He looked at me from the cross and said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Look, we saw the transfiguration. We had box seats right next to Elijah and Moses. Jesus told them, "You tell no one what you saw." Because their stories are the stories that matter. I want you to listen. I want you to truly listen to the stories of other people. There are people walking around in this world dying to be noticed or simply dying. And as followers of Christ, we need to hear and respond. In being church, it's not about our past or our present alone. It's about everybody else's story, hearing it and responding to it. So Jesus and the disciples went back down the mountain, and in the very next few verses, they encounter an epileptic child and hear that family story. And from there, Jesus encounters a rich young ruler and hears his story. And the very next chapter, there are children who want to come and crawl up in Jesus' lap, and people are telling him no, and he says, no, let them come. I want to hear their stories. And just a few verses after that, Jesus is answering questions with Pharisees because he wants to hear their stories. Jesus listened to people's stories, taught his followers to do the same, because every story matters. And so today we're going to come down from this mountain and we're going to leave this sanctuary. We're going to leave these box seats in the presence of God. No better place to be on a Sunday morning. But we need to go from this place and listen to the stories. To the stories of those who struggle with addiction, to the stories of immigrants, to the stories of struggling parents and struggling spouses, to the stories of refugees and the stories of homeless people, the stories of our friends who seem like they've got everything and yet their life still feels empty. We need to listen to everyone and anyone, because we know as people of faith that every story matters.